Welcome to the Pro-Life Action League series, Converted from Abortion Provider to Pro-Life Activist. In the following talk, former Planned Parenthood worker Catherine Adair explains why she quit her job at the nation's largest abortion provider and later became an advocate for life.
Thank you so much. I have to say that I feel like I've learned more today than more wisdom than I could possibly impart to anybody. And I certainly hope that that dad that wrote that letter that Dr. Brukalski was telling us about never meets me as we welcome our fifth child into our 1,200 square foot, one bathroom house. You know, it's been interesting to hear everybody's stories, and I want to tell you a little bit today about how I came to work at Planned Parenthood, what the day-to-day job was, what I did there, what I saw there, and why I left, and then how I converted to being pro-life. You know, like a few other speakers said today, I came from a very liberal family, and we never talked about abortion, but certainly, you know, my dad was very involved in the Democratic Party and the teachers union. My mom was a founding member of the local chapter of our National Organization for Women. I'm one of four daughters who she raised to be very independent women. We were brought up Catholic in the sense that we went to church on Sundays. But it was really more of a cultural Catholicism where my mom and dad liked to, schmooze with everybody over the coffee and donuts after Mass. But we had no Bible. We never prayed. I really knew very little about the faith. But I knew I loved Jesus. And in fact, like Abby said, the only thing I ever wanted to be when I grew up was a nun. Although I never wore a towel around the house because I don't know what my mother would have done about that. In my house, religion was for people who couldn't think for themselves. You know, we were intellectuals. My dad was a teacher. He was a history buff. We talked about politics, but and so it was sort of implied as I grew older, and my mom was this feminist, that abortion was a women's rights issue. And so I believed that. So much so that when I was 19 and I was pregnant, I didn't know what to do. But when I found out I was pregnant, you always have this initial, a baby. You're happy, even though my life circumstances were such that it didn't make any sense to have a baby. I wasn't married, I hadn't finished college, I had no way to support myself. But there's always that piece of you that just, it's a miracle, it's a baby. And I really put off telling my mom for many weeks until I realized I had to tell her. And when I told my mom, she said, well, abortion is legal now. It's your right. Don't worry about it. And right away, I immediately, all these ideas I'd had of, my boyfriend and I were going to live in the basement, and we were going to raise our child, and we were going to work and go to college, and this vision I had, I just realized, oh, you're so stupid. How could you ever think you could have a baby? And she and my doctor, she said, well, I'll talk to our family doctor. And I went in to see the family doctor, and she said, well, I'll make an appointment for you at the clinic. And, we never discussed it. I think my mom and her had talked ahead of time. And so I allowed myself to be sort of brought along into this, and of course they say, you've waited too long. You've got to do this now. We have to get this done this week. I was 11 weeks already. And all of a sudden I felt like I had no choice. I felt silly, I felt ashamed, and so I went along with it, and I went to the clinic with my mom, and it just sort of felt very surreal to me. I felt very childish, I felt scared, and I felt sad. I felt sad. But so I went in, and at this clinic, it was not a Planned Parenthood, it was another clinic. They give you general anesthesia, so I don't have any memory of it. And I remember waking up in the recovery room, and I just felt so empty. Not just the physical emptiness, but the spiritual emptiness. You know, I really feel that I lost a piece of my soul that day. That it was something you can't change, you can't fix it, it's done. And you know, they say, oh, you know, you're going to feel relief afterwards, and of course you do. You feel relieved. This terrible, you know, anxiety you've had for weeks, this terrible decision you've had to make, and not wanting to talk to anybody about it, and yet wanting to talk to people about it, and not knowing who to turn to. And so that's over. You can move on with your life. But what they don't tell you is that you're going to suffer for years with anxiety, depression, sadness. Some women, you know, drug addiction, alcoholism, promiscuity, all these problems that come along with it. And because you're told that you're going to be relieved, you think there's something wrong with you. I must be crazy. Why do I feel this way? Why do I feel depressed? Why am I anxious all the time? Why do I have these horrible, hateful feelings towards myself? And you never connect it with the abortion. So I think that for me, when I left and I walked out of the clinic, and there was a little room where people wait for you, and my mom was standing there, and I just burst into tears. And I looked at her, and she kind of looked at me like, you know, what's wrong with you? And I just made this decision right at that moment. I said, I'm never going to talk about this. I'm not going to think about it. It's done. It's in the past. And we got in the car together, and we went for lunch, and we never talked about it. And I think my way of dealing with that was that I threw myself into this radical feminism. You know, I didn't just sort of have that click where I'm not going to think about it. I had this click where, for me, we weren't even talking about people. Abortion was our right, and if we didn't have the right to abortion, then terrible things were going to happen to women, and we were going to be thrown back to the Stone Age, and we really had to fight for this right. So I went to, you know, back to college. I changed my major. I was a women's studies major now. I became a radical feminist. I marched on Washington for women's rights. And I have this picture of myself like holding up this big sign, you know, feminists are the majority. And, you know, all these times I went down to Washington to march for abortion rights. And I believed it. You know, I believed all this sort of radical feminist stuff. And in fact, I was going to be the most radical feminist. And so when I saw, after I graduated from college, that Planned Parenthood was hiring, I jumped at the chance. I was really excited. I didn't think of, I really bought sort of the corporate line that Planned Parenthood puts out there. You know, they really align themselves with the left. You know, they're progressive. And I wanted to be a part of that. You know, I didn't get involved in Planned Parenthood because I was, you know, compassionate and I wanted to help women. I got involved in Planned Parenthood because I felt like it was a badge of honor. That this is how radical I am. I'm so radical, I work for Planned Parenthood, which is the most amazing women's organization in the world. And of course, this was at the time that I worked in their clinic in Boston, that a man named John Salvi, several months prior, had gone into the clinic and killed 2 women that worked there, 2 receptionists. And I think he had gone to some other clinics as well. And so it was a time of real intense, heightened feelings amongst the pro-choice people, because we felt that we were under attack, and as other people have said, you know, these crazy pro-lifers are out to get us. And I think Planned Parenthood really used that as a way to create this climate of fear amongst people that worked there and people that supported them. You know, I, shortly after I started, they moved into this new building. And this new building had bulletproof glass. It had a bomb-proof garage underneath the building. We had an armed security guard and a metal detector as you walked into the building, and we had an entrance underneath so that the workers never had to walk out in the front of the clinic. Because every day when I went to work, if I took the subway and I walked to work, the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up because I was terrified that someone was going to shoot me on the way to work. Or, you'd be afraid that somebody was going to try to bomb the clinic. And that was sort of the atmosphere that I worked in. And so it created this idea that pro-life people were crazy. And that not only were we, working for women's rights, but we were really putting our lives on the line for the cause. And so when I went for the interview at Planned Parenthood, she said to me, do you have any problem with abortion? And I thought, no. Why would I have a problem with abortion? There's nothing wrong with abortion. It's fine. And so what they do, I want to tell you a little bit about how it worked when I was there. What they do is they sort of ease you into it. When I was first hired, I worked as a receptionist. So I checked people in, I gave them the medical history form to fill out, did that for a little while. And then they train you to answer the phones and how to make appointments. Did that for a little while. And then they train you to be a counselor. And this I found, this is where sort of my disillusionment with Planned Parenthood kind of started. Counseling to me, I thought was going to be, talking with the woman about her decision, what brought her there, anything that she needed to talk about. But instead, we were given this white coat to wear, and this, what do you call that thingamajig you wear around your neck when you're a doctor? Stethoscope, yeah, so you should really trust in me when I'm your counselor. That thingy-majiggy, who's-he, what's it? So we're given that to wear and, to look like, we're these official people that know what we're doing. Mind you, I'm a women's studies major. So my job as a counselor was to, bring the woman into the room, try to make her feel comfortable, and to basically go through the medical history with her, because being a women's studies major, I knew all of those, random diseases and so forth that they checked off on the form. I hate men. No. So at any rate, so I went through her medical history with her. I took her blood pressure. I took her pulse. I explained the abortion procedure to her, and this is the way we explain the procedure. If you're nervous, now we'll give you a local anesthetic, and if you're nervous, you can have, I don't remember what they gave them, something to calm them down. And the doctor will come in, he'll insert a speculum, and then he'll gently remove the contents of the uterus. And then you'll go to recovery. Very quick, about 15 minutes. So that was the explanation of the abortion. Gently extract the contents of the uterus. We were required to say, that you could give this baby up for adoption or you could keep it. You know that, right? And they would say yes, and that was it. That was the counseling. The assumption is once she's there, she knows what she wants. Who am I to tell her this isn't what she wants? She's a grown woman making her own decision. And yet at the same time, we couldn't say baby or fetus or embryo because that might upset her. So is she a grown woman making her own decision, or is she a child that we have to protect from the truth? Which one is it? And it really became difficult for me because, of course, women, you're in this very vulnerable position. You're not going to ask a lot of questions. We never describe fetal development. We never ask what brought you to this decision. Is there anything you need? Is there any information we can give you? Never. Never. And mind you, of course, the first thing that happens after they check into the clinic is we take their money. So once they've been to the counseling room, they've already paid for the abortion. So the assumption is, and in her mind, I've paid for this, I've done all this, done these steps so far, and the next step is to have it done. And, so many things would happen in that counseling room that really bothered me. There'd be girls coming in with their abusers. Against all protocol, the abuser would be, let into the counseling room. That was where they were supposed to sort of be separated from who they were with, and men were never allowed back there. But with these young girls, they'd be allowed back there and even if they knew, even if I went to the manager and I said, look, there's something going on here, she would say, she's better off with the abortion. We can't do anything about what's going on at home, but at least we can give her the abortion. Or we'd have women who don't speak English who'd come in. I remember one woman in particular, she was from Somalia. She came in with her husband, her brother-in-law, and one of their friends who spoke English, broken English. And she sat there the entire time looking at the floor, and the brother and the brother-in-law were talking, and very sort of strongly, and the gentleman that spoke English was like, just give her the abortion, just give her the abortion, it's what she wants, it's what she wants. And I went to my supervisor, I said, I can't be sure that this is what this woman wants because she can't speak for herself, and she looks very nervous, and she's looking at the floor, and she seems intimidated to me. I think she's being forced into this. And so my manager came in and said to the man that spoke English, could you have her say that this is what she wants? So the man said to her in her language whatever he said, and she nodded her head, and she said, it's fine. And off she went to have the abortion. And I remember that specifically because I remember thinking, but this is supposed to be her choice. How do we know this is her choice? How do we know? We don't know. And yet, we're allowing this to happen to her. And so I was just becoming increasingly uncomfortable with what was going on in the counseling room. But soon after that, or at a certain point, I became, once you're doing that for a while, they train you to be what they call a medical assistant. And as a medical assistant, I was in the procedure room, with the doctor and the nurse. My job was basically to, if she needed her hand held, I'd hold her hand. If the doctor or nurse needed anything, I would give it to them. The biggest part of my job was to clean up the room after the abortion was done. And quickly, because we would have two abortionists working, and we had two sides of the clinic, and they didn't like to wait. So we had to go from room to room to room to room and clean them up very quickly so the doctor could move on. And I have to laugh about Planned Parenthood talking about the doctor-patient relationship when they talk about abortion. Here's what the doctor-patient relationship was at our clinic. My job was to bring the girl into the room, and the woman into the room. She'd have a Johnny on, lie her down, get her feet in the stirrups, make sure her body was in the right position, and then the nurse would come in, make sure the instruments were there, and when it was all ready to go, the doctor came in. If she was lucky, he might make eye contact with her. Might even say her name. Usually not. And they would do the abortion, and they would leave. And then I was left alone with her to determine when she was ready to go to the recovery room. And that really frightened me. I found that really scary because a lot of times women will have this vasovagal reaction and they would faint. And it was really scary. And here I was, being told that I'm the one that's going to decide when they're ready to go to recovery, and again, it needed to be done quickly, and I hated when I was assigned to be a medical assistant because of that. I didn't. It's funny to say that because of course you're witnessing this baby being torn to pieces, and yet I got scared because what if she faints on me? But again, it doesn't surprise me when I hear stories that they're going to, train anybody to do transvaginal ultrasounds because it didn't matter that I had no medical training at all, but yet I was being left with this patient. So, and of course, then we had to clean up the room, and one of our jobs was to, the nurse was the one who would be looking at determining that all the parts had been taken out during the abortion, and then we would take that and we poured in this little baggie, and they were called POCs, products of conception, and we would put them in this little box in the refrigerator, and at the end of the day I had to count them all up, make sure the POCs equaled the number of abortions we'd had that day. And of course we would joke around and call the POCs pieces of children. Just one of the many jokes. I know some other folks have talked about sort of that macabre humor. And of course now I can see the horror of that, but at the time I could say that without even thinking of them as human beings. I thought it was funny that other people thought we were killing children. That's ridiculous. Why would we be killing children? But that's how shut off my brain was. And so that was one of the jobs that we had. And so I did that for a while. And one particular day, we did second trimester abortions at my clinic. And as a counselor, I'd counseled for this many, many times. I would say, on the first day, the doctor was going to insert laminaria to stretch your cervix, and the next day, you'll come back and he'll gently extract the contents of the uterus. Same thing. I had no idea what they really did. I didn't have a clue. I didn't know anything about fetal development. I had no idea. And in fact, when a woman would come for a second trimester abortion, the counseling was the same. We never asked, what's bringing you here today? Have you thought about other choices? No, never. It was assumed that she knew what she wanted. So although I had counseled for second trimester abortions many times, I had never been in the procedure room because there were two girls that worked with a doctor. There's one doctor that did second trimester abortions. He came in on certain days. They used a special room that was in the back of the clinic. And so these two girls were the medical assistants. One was out that day. And so at a certain point during the day, this girl came to me and she said, "Hey, could you go finish cleaning up the room in the back because we're shorthanded?" And I said, okay. I was nervous about it. I'd never been back there. And I approached it with some trepidation, but walked to the back of the clinic. And, in the back, it was very quiet. It's very removed from the other area. And I walked into the room, and I was trying to get my bearings. I didn't know where things were. The room was bigger than the other procedure rooms. And trying to figure out where things were. And I look over at the table, the little table where the instruments were next to where the woman had lied, and there was a jar. And in the jar were arms and legs. And I stood there and I looked at it, and at first it was almost looking at the beauty of the perfection of these little feet attached to this leg and these little hands. And then I couldn't process it. I thought, I can't be seeing this. This isn't real. And I just backed out of the room in shock. And I went to the girl and I said, I can't do this. And she said, I'm so sorry. I thought everything had been taken care of. I'm so sorry. And she said, do you want to talk to this nurse, And I was like, no, I don't want to talk to anybody. And, I had just this horrible sense that I had been lied to. And I didn't realize it before. I didn't realize we were talking about babies. And when I saw that, I couldn't lie anymore. I'd seen it. And I didn't know what they did in a second trimester abortion. I'd seen, obviously, everything that happens after a first trimester abortion. And to this day, I can't tell you why that was different for me. Sometimes I think that God put me there at that moment, in this very quiet part of the clinic. There was nobody else around to say, look, look at what you're doing. Look at what you're doing. And I think, gosh, why didn't I just run out of that clinic and, tell people what's going on in there? Why did I get up and go to work the next day? I don't know, but I did. And yet everything had changed. Everything was different for me. At this point I was already, as Abby described, I was having terrible nightmares. I would have this nightmare of these just blackness with baby parts floating around, and I couldn't breathe and I couldn't move, and I'd wake up screaming. And I was very anxious all the time. And so but I still kept going back to work. But yet I was angry. But instead of being angry at the clinic, I was angry at the women coming in. And I think I almost felt like, how dare you make me have to do this? Like I was taking it out on them. I was just getting angrier and angrier. And so I said, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to leave. But I didn't leave because I became pro-life or because I thought what we were doing was wrong in an intellectual sense. I left because emotionally I couldn't handle it anymore. I think I was just emotionally close to having a breakdown. And so I said, you know what? Forget this social work stuff. I'm going to go to grad school. I'm going to be a teacher. That's what I'm going to do. And so I did. So I left and went to grad school, got my master's in teaching, and went from one very lucrative profession to another. And I became a teacher, and I got married, and we had children. And I never told anybody I'd worked at Planned Parenthood. I didn't put it on my resume, I didn't talk about it, never told anybody. But yet I still identified with being pro-choice. I still identified with being progressive, with being more of a feminist. Because if I wasn't that, then I was one of them. Those kooky folks out on the sidewalk with their rosaries and, those intolerant women hating type, the type, the pro-lifers. So, and I certainly didn't want to be one of them. And so I just left it behind and I never talked about it, and I just, started living this new life. And of course, like many people, when we have children, we start thinking, I should probably teach them about that God thing. My husband, who was always a very faithful Catholic, although not practicing all the time when he was with me, said, well, let's start going back to church. And I said, all right. I was like, yeah, there's a Unitarian church right up the street. That'd be great. So we went to the Unitarian church and had a little water ceremony, or I don't know what it was. But I left thinking, gosh, there's just nothing to it. No, this isn't right. This isn't for me. And I said, well, let's try, I don't know, congregational or, something like that. And he's like, no, let's just go to Mass. I was like, fine, we'll go to Mass. So we go, and we liked it. This church was really nice. We liked the priests. They had nice music, and I enjoyed it. So we kept going, and they needed a CCD teacher, and I said, well, I could do that. Now, a lot of people are horrified by the prospect of me, and they should be, teaching CCD, but they were desperate. I mean, this is like a city, really poor urban church that is just desperate for people to be in their CCD, classes and teaching, really desperate. So I started teaching the 3rd and 4th grade CCD. And I loved it, and these children were wonderful. And as I was teaching, of course, I was learning. And I felt, well, I really can't be a hypocrite here because I'm teaching these kids about the faith, and I haven't been to confession since high school. So I should probably do that. But, really what had happened was I had this yearning for Jesus. I knew that he would forgive me, but I knew I had to ask. And So I decided I was going to go to confession. So I went to church on the Saturday, and then I left. Walked right out. Went in, walked right out. So I said, I'll do it next Saturday. I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna do it. Go to the church the next Saturday. Walk in. I sit in the back pew, and I leave. And I did that, no exaggeration, 10 times. 10 times I went in. And finally, Easter was coming up, and I was like, I am receiving the Eucharist on Easter. I'm doing it. So I went to confession, scared out of my mind. And in between sobs, poured out my heart to Father. And he said, do you know how much Jesus loves you? I started crying again. Because, no, I don't. I have no idea how much Jesus loves me. How could he possibly love me knowing what I've done, what I've been a part of? There's no way Jesus loves me. And he said, well, I want you to pray the rosary. And he asked me to pray the rosary, the luminous mysteries. Now, the fifth luminous mystery is the institution of the Eucharist, right? Yeah, got that right. And I thought, oh my goodness, how could he know that this yearning I have for Jesus, and he forgave me my sins, and I knew I was forgiven. Now, I knew I was forgiven up here, but I didn't know it in my heart. And I started praying the rosary, and I would pray the rosary every day, and I would cry every time, and I just couldn't accept the forgiveness. So my friend invited me on this retreat. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of this woman. Her name is Immaculée Ilibengiza. Okay. She is a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. And she survived by hiding in this bathroom, about 4 feet by 7 feet maybe, with 8 other women for 91 days. When people, if you know anything about the Rwandan genocide, it was extraordinarily brutal in that people were literally being hacked to death with machetes, all sorts of brutality. Her entire family was murdered. Her father shot in the back, her mother macheted to death, 2 brothers macheted to death. 1 brother survived because he was in Senegal at the time. And she went on this weekend retreat, and she talked about forgiveness, the healing power of forgiveness. And she talked about how, as she's praying in this bathroom, she's praying and praying and praying, but it's just not, she's just so angry, it's not working, until God said to her, you have to forgive the killers. You have to forgive the killers. And she did, truly, from the heart. Not just an I forgive you, but from the heart, from the depth of her being, she forgave these people who had murdered her family. And this incredible peace came upon her. And I would highly recommend reading her books if you can. But it was tremendously powerful for me, because what I realized is that I'm the one that has to ask forgiveness. I'm the murderer. I have to ask forgiveness of my own child that I killed. All of these children that I participated in their killing, I have to ask their forgiveness. And the only way I can ask for forgiveness is through God, because they're not here. I can't physically ask their forgiveness, but I can ask God, in proxy perhaps, I don't know, for their forgiveness. And when I realized that, I truly felt healed in so many ways, because I needed that forgiveness. I needed to be able to say to my child, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I did. And, because you never forget that child. The abortion does not take care of a problem. It creates a problem. Every night I tuck my kids into bed, and after they fall asleep, I go in and give them a little kiss, give them a little blessing, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I ask God to bless that one. Give her a little kiss from me, because I think about her every day. And yet, it took me over 20 years to really face it. I didn't think about it for 20 years. And but yet, I think about that child every day, every single day. So, in a way I say, oh, this is my 5th, but really it's my 6th, because that child is my child. And all those children were somebody's child. And lately I've been really thinking about that second trimester abortion that I saw. I'm thinking about the mother. I'm in my 21st week of this pregnancy, and I can feel this baby moving. I'm very aware of it all the time. It's beautiful. And I think she must have felt the baby moving before she had this abortion. She must have. We did abortions up to 23 weeks, 6 days. She must have felt this baby moving. And I think, what was it like afterwards? You go home and that baby's gone. You're not feeling anything. It's just gone. How do you deal with that? I wonder, I'm like, she must be grieving that child in some way, whether it's what I did by just completely pretending it never happened, or I don't know, but I think about the pain and the suffering of so many mothers, so many fathers, and then I think about these babies. Who knew about that baby even existed? Her mother, the abortionist, the nurse, me, maybe a few other people she told, but really there's I think one of the reasons why abortion keeps growing and happening is because nobody sees the victim. There's no victim of this Holocaust because you can't see that victim. I don't know if my baby was thrown in the trash, incinerated, used for medical experiments, sold to some company so they could figure out how to make our soft drinks taste better. I have no idea. Somebody said to me recently, a friend of mine said, gosh, it must be so sad not to know where your child is buried. And I realized I had never thought about it. And now I think about that every day. These babies, these POCs, are sent to the lab, and then what? We know they're sold to companies for all kinds of research. Some are dumped in the trash, some are burned. We don't know. And so all these mothers who've lost their children and don't know where they're buried. It's the silent victim, the faceless victim. Society, anyone that says they're pro-choice, they don't have to look at the victims of that choice. Those victims don't exist in their world. But they are victims. And there is death involved. And, I really believe because we can't see it, it's hard. That's another reason why it's hard to bridge that gap to folks, because they don't think of it as there being a victim involved. They think of it as just being a choice of the mother. And I really try to explain to people, what I've seen. Look, I've seen it. So they either ignore me or they call me a liar. I'm sure the other speakers here today have had that experience too. But I know we're running late, and I didn't want to talk for too long, but I did want to just say, something that really struck me as I was reading Immaculate's book, where she talks about sort of how you have to be led by faith. That's the name of her book. You have to be led by faith. Because what happened to me, I'll tell you very, very quickly. I started volunteering for this CareNet locally, and a friend of mine had said to me, oh, this is when my son was, my 2-year-old was just a baby. She said, oh, I've got all these baby wipes, and I don't need them, so I'm going to give them to you. So she comes to my house with this huge box of baby wipes. And I thought, what am I going to do? I can buy my own baby wipes. I'm going to give them to CareNet. So I called them up, and I said, I've got this huge box of baby wipes. This was 2 years ago. And she said, oh, bring them by. We'd love to have them. So I get there, and there's one woman there, the nurse manager, and we start talking. And I said to her, just out of the blue, I said, I used to work at Planned Parenthood. And her eyes just went wide. And I'd never told anybody this before. I felt like it was, just like my soul being laid bare. And I didn't even know why I told her. And I told her my story about how I'd had an abortion and I worked at Planned Parenthood. And she said, could you share your testimony at our dinner? And I thought, what does she mean? What's a testimony? I had no idea. I was like, what am I, going to court? Like, I had no idea, what this meant. And so I was like, sure, And so they were very kind. They actually videotaped me so I didn't have to speak in front of anybody. And so I went to their dinner, and, as the lights dimmed and the video was going to come on, I was like, oh, I can kind of sneak out the back and nobody will know it's me. And because I was like, people are going to hate me. They're going to throw things at me. They're going to, throw their cheesecake at me and yell at me and call me a murderer. And after the video, the lights came up and people were crying. And they were just coming over to me and hugging me and just giving me so much love. Like, this love of pro-life folks is like a love I never knew existed. There's not a lot of love on the other side. It's all me, 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 me. And you folks have given me so much strength and so much courage, and I just want to really, thank you for that, for your prayers, for your love, for your compassion, for all the work that you do, because it completely changed my life and the lives of my children, my family too. So thank you very much, and God bless all of you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Catherine, I'm coming from the perspective of a grandmother. I have a slew of grandchildren. When you told your mother that you were pregnant, were you expecting that she would say abortion is the answer?
No. No, I thought that we would.
Thought it would work out?
Yeah, I really did. And yet, immediately when she said, oh, abortion is legal now, it just changed everything for me. I was goody two-shoes. I never wanted to do anything to displease my parents. I thought the world of my parents, still do. And even though they have an 8x10 of Obama next to the 5x7 of my children, still love them, pray for them. But I didn't want to disappoint them. I'm sorry, so sorry, yes. So.
We have just a few more minutes for questions if there are any other questions.
Hi, Catherine. As I was listening to your testimony, it sounded as though the clinic where you were working was very busy. And I was wondering, what was the overall cleanliness of the particular property where you were? Because I've heard some guesses.
It was a very busy clinic, and in fact, it is the largest abortion clinic in New England, and that's all we did. Monday through Saturday, all day, that's all we did was abortions. I didn't even know there were Planned Parenthoods that existed that didn't do that. I would say that in some ways, it was very clean. They were very particular about sterilizing the instruments. On the other hand, it wasn't very clean because we had to work very quickly to clean up those rooms, and we would get the blood spatters that we could see, but you didn't always get all of them, and you didn't have time to wash the floor in between patients, so there oftentimes could be some blood on the floor and so forth. I would not put it in the, I have to say that I've been shocked to hear some of the stories that I hear about abortion clinics. I wouldn't put it in that category at all, and in fact, I think that's the reason why I felt better about it, like as though Planned Parenthood was above these other clinics. Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this talk from the Pro-Life Action League's conference, Converted from Abortion Provider to Pro-Life Activist, held on September 22nd, 2012 in Chicago, Illinois. For more talks from this conference or more information on the work of the Pro-Life Action League, visit prolifeaction.org.